Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be in your day and in the world. Welcome to How to Align Digital Transformations to Business Strategy. I'm Kristy Lapidus with Soliant Consulting. My role with Soliant Consulting is as the business strategy lead for the AWS practice. I rejoined Soliant in February of 2020 after having worked here for 6 years up until 2013. At which time I was recruited to become the director of IT PMO at a manufacturing company in North Carolina. And it was while I was working at this manufacturing company where I was supporting all of the different departments across the entire enterprise, where I became fascinated by the people and strategy side of technology projects. So I decided to go back to grad school and learn more about it. I matriculated into the Master's of Science in Organization Development program at Pepperdine University, and my cohort and I studied all over the world. We traveled to China, Costa Rica, France, and Washington, D.C., and performed consulting engagements with large international organizations. This was right before the pandemic hit. I graduated in 2019, so we were very lucky to be able to travel and to learn how to design and implement strategy and cultural change in an international setting. And from a broader perspective, how to apply behavioral science to improve organizations. At the same time, I've been developing on the FileMaker platform for almost 20 years now. And this will be my third time presenting at DevCon or Claris Engage. Right before starting grad school, I decided to spin up my own consulting practice that focused on technology strategy, change management, and digital transformations on the Claris platform. And so that's what I decided to study in my thesis research as well. Specifically, I looked at the impact of scenario planning on the efficacy of digital transformations with a consulting company supporting the high-tech industry in Silicon Valley. And so in this session today, I will share with you the insights that I gained from that research. Thanks for joining. So I'll just throw up my thesis research title here on the screen so that for you visual learners out there, you can see it. It's the impact of scenario planning on the efficacy of digital transformations. In other words, how to crush uncertainty. Because scenario planning, unlike other single stream approaches to strategy, allows you to prepare for multiple different scenarios that you may not have considered previously. And the beauty in this is that with all of the uncertainty that we have been faced with in 2020 and even before 2020, we've been living in an increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. And so scenario planning has a capability to bring us some hope to be able to deal with this uncertainty. And that's how I would like to leave you after this session, hopeful and open to new ways of thinking and working. Because right now, you may not, if you're an external consultant, you may not be talking to your clients about their business strategy. If you're internal, you may not be connecting with your business partners on what the strategy is for your organization. And being able to do that and to think about it and to speak that language with our business partners will not only up-level you as a partner, but also will really provide you the ability to create more resilient solutions for your clients, whether they're internal or external. Let's dig in. We'll start by setting the context by delving into the 5 pillars of digital transformations that we have developed at Soliant Consulting. I want to give a quick shout out to Bill Heiser, whom I've worked with very closely on this. Bill is the director of the AWS practice at Soliant and was a senior engineer at Claris FileMaker for many years. You'll also learn about the evolution of strategic planning, and specifically the pros and cons of business planning techniques like SOAR and SWOT. Then we'll go through a step-by-step process of how to conduct scenario planning. And then we'll look at my thesis research findings. And woven into those will be the description of how to align digital transformations to business strategy. And finally, we'll do a quick summary to let everything sink in. The 5 pillars of digital transformations. We started automating and optimizing business processes 30 years ago, taking data and processes that our clients tracked on paper or in Excel, and we designed software systems that could do much of the laborious work to set the humans free to be able to focus on the business problems. And we just didn't call it a digital transformation at that time, right? And there's a lot of hype around this idea of digital transformation. And in fact, one of the researchers that I've drawn a lot of my understandings from is Gerald C. Kane. He's a professor at Boston College, and he is trying to cut through the hype, and instead of referring to digital transformations, he has come up with the term digital maturity, because digital maturity emphasizes a lot of different things, among them that it's not about one transformation in today's world. We're operating in such an uncertain environment that we have to continually transform in today's day and age. In fact, in the 21st century, with the increase in compute power, the ubiquity of electronic devices, and advances in AI data sets, along with Moore's Law giving way to Huang's Law, information technology began permeating nearly every aspect of business management, including in the widespread evolution of new business models. Whereas in the early days of digital transformations, most projects were in the closed environment of a business organization with maybe some of the outputs touching customers. Today, most organizations are open environments with a multitude of different touch points with the outside world. And for example, many corporations are now going into having an organizational design in which they have core full-time members, and then they have a periphery of contract and part-time gig freelance workers. And that's only going to continue to grow according to studies. Then you combine that with ever-advancing technology, globalization, and a worldwide pandemic, and digital transformations look very different today than they did 30 years ago. Still, there are a lot of different viewpoints on what digital transformations actually are. Some researchers and practitioners argue that digital transformations must be sustainable, improve profitability, and impact the enterprise level. But there's not consensus in the field as to what it actually are, beyond what most practitioners and researchers can agree that these characteristics are vital. It must, as a digital transformation, require a change in revenue and business model, while optimizations do not. Must fundamentally improve business results through technology. Must be driven by strategy and growth targets more than by technology. Change management is a vital part of success. And organizations must undergo digital transformations often to survive. By that commonly accepted list of characteristics, that means that not all software projects, not all Claris FileMaker projects would be considered digital transformations. But they all have the potential to be. How? By aligning the work that we do as technologists with our clients' business strategy. You might be thinking, my clients are not interested in discussing their business strategy. They want to focus on the systems that we're enhancing or creating. Or if you're a business owner, you might be thinking, my business is not tech related, so how would my business strategy be impacted by technology? With disruption across industries accelerating at an unprecedented rate, all organizations must invest in technology today. Yet, narrowly focusing on upgrading one technology platform upgrade will not increase your competitiveness. Instead, take a strategic view with the goal of creating sustainable organizational agility that allows you to continuously evolve. The oft-cited constant change in today's complex business environment compels leaders to transform both strategy and operations. As a 2017 Couchbase study found, businesses from across the vast majority of industries are doomed to last only 5 years before going out of business or being absorbed by a competitor if they do not undergo digital transformation. In 2020, we have all observed how the ability to operate and offer value digitally drives organizational agility. Adaptability is more important to organizations now than at any point in history. In fact, an organization's ability to adapt and respond with agility has been shown to provide a distinct competitive advantage, with agile organizations outperforming their competitors by more than 2 to 1. And that last statistics was from some research that one of my professors at Pepperdine conducted, Dr. Chris Worley, pre-COVID. What's interesting is that with all of that in mind, the success rate for digital transformations is abysmal. In fact, the failure rate is at 95%. So, what can you do to ensure that your transformation is successful? You can use the 5 pillars of digital transformation that we've developed at Soliant Consulting. We've developed these pillars in large part through the research that I did in my thesis, and also through the many long years of digital transformations that Soliant has been designing and implementing. We'll dig into 2 of the pillars today. We'll cover all of them, but we'll only really dig deeply into 2 of them as they pertain to this presentation subject matter. And the other 3, so I've recently written a blog post on the Soliant blog, which you can go check out, and that goes into more detail on some of the other 3. The first one is strategic alignment. So obviously, this is very pertinent to what we're discussing today. When planning a digital strategy, what research shows is the most effective approach is to work toward a future vision rather than focusing on the consequences of past events. That's why it's imperative to involve business leaders in your digital transformation project to do an environmental scan to understand what's happening in the environment around you that might impact you, using a tool like scenario planning that is based on routinely scanning your environment for potential impacts to your business. And we'll delve much more deeply into that. The second one is a fundamental alteration. So as discussed, digital transformations must intrinsically improve business results through technology. Further, intrinsically improving business results often requires fundamentally altering business models, processes, and capabilities. Given that such fundamental alterations come with significant risk and expense, the decision to make an intrinsic shift is often a matter of survival that requires excellence in governance and processes. And that brings us to number 3, which is much more than compliance regulation. You need an executive champion, and that execs or small business owner's role does involve providing risk, compliance, and cost oversight. But first and foremost, they need to set the vision and be able to provide the transformation manager with the necessary resources to ensure project success. The executive's main role is to remove blockers and to enable positive results so that organic movement and innovation can occur. This all sounds complicated and time-consuming, doesn't it? Well, that's why the next pillar is iterative and data-driven. We focus our transformation roadmap on iterative milestones so that we can bring measurable value fast. We outline the full roadmap of the transformation and then break it into small pieces to fulfill the requirements in an agile, iterative way. And you can check out my colleague Sarah Severson's session on release planning for more information on how to do that. And the 5th pillar is another one like strategic alignment that we will be focusing on today: co-creation and collaboration. True transformations require a cultural change. Cultural change must occur at the organizational level, the department or team level, and the individual level simultaneously. And that takes structured collaboration and the application of behavioral science. At Soliant, we design participative workshops that invite structured collaboration. The first step is to include participants from across the business. Then, using large-scale change methodologies, draw input from diverse forms of knowledge, expertise, and perspectives to produce resilient plans. Many of you probably do this as part of your existing requirements gathering processes today. Circling back to our first pillar of strategic alignments, Let's look at the evolution of strategic planning first, so that way we can have a broad understanding of the necessity of strategic alignment. Well, first of all, what is it? As Socrates says, the definition of terms is the beginning of wisdom. So let's start there. In brief, strategic planning can be described as a business management process in which leaders identify external, very important, both external and internal factors about which they make decisions concerning the future of their organizations. Strategic planning is more concerned with the big picture, and its focus is on the results or outcomes rather than products or outputs. And in today's turbulent environment, planning for the future can be pretty tricky. So, as management guru Peter Drucker asks, what do we have to do today to be ready for an uncertain tomorrow? As we all know, 2020 was really one of the most chaotic years in the last 100 at least. And so we're learning, hopefully all of us are learning not only how to survive, but how to thrive in uncertainty. However, we know that it was never possible to predict the future, right? But it was once possible to use data points of the past to forecast with some certainty what the future might hold. The history of strategic planning can be traced back several thousand years, and it has its roots in the military. In fact, the word strategy originates from the Greek word strategos, which means general of the army. When strategic planning first entered into the corporate environment in the 1920s via the Harvard policy model, which we'll go into a little bit later when we talk about SWOT, the operating environment was much more stable than it is now. I mean, obviously we had Great Depression, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam, and all of that. But in general, the world was less connected, right? You didn't know what was happening across the world instantaneously. It was less globalized. It was, in general, just a much more stable environment on a daily, weekly, and yearly operating level. So organizations were able to take the data points of their past and say, okay, this is what happened last year. We can predict that this is probably going to happen next year. And we're going to base our strategy around that. And using the Harvard policy model, we will scan the environment. But it was a much more predictable way of approaching strategy. And so that approach was called forecasting. Then what happened was that in the late 1960s, Shell Oil, which was one of the younger sisters of the great oil companies at that time, and they realized they did some forecasting with their planning department all the way up into the year 2000. And what they realized is that, okay, if we continue to grow year over year based upon the data points of the past, we're going to get to the year 2000. And it just will no longer be realistic to be able to grow in that way anymore because we're going to reach peak oil. So we need to start thinking and planning for the future, in a different way. And that laid the groundwork for the approach of scenario planning, where instead of looking at data points of the past, you prepare for multiple possible futures based on environmental scans and looking at the realistic data points of the present and the future. And this is a very simple breakdown of strategic planning, and there's so many articles, so many books written about this. But for our purposes today, this is really the main crux of what we're looking at here, because it's a very different approach to look toward the past rather than looking toward the future when you're planning. And that's what we have to do today. And the guy that Shell Oil picked to do this work for them, to head up this work, was Pierre Wake. And he first came into contact with scenario planning through Herman Kahn, who was a military strategist, a futurist, and the Hudson Institute founder. Well, before Kahn founded the Hudson Institute, he was working at the RAND Corporation, which is a research group connected to the U.S. Air Force and the Douglas Aircraft Company. And while it ran, Khan took advantage of the advancements in computing to process large data sets and come up with scenarios that challenged the accepted military strategy of the day. So he became pretty famous. That allowed him to found the Hudson Institute with some of his colleagues, and that's how Pierre heard of him. And Herman used scenarios in his work. And so Pierre met with Herman and started to think about future planning in a different way. And Pierre Wake is one of the main reasons that I wanted to study scenario planning in my thesis research, because he's fascinating. He, if you can picture it, was this French oil executive. He was debonair. He was sophisticated. He was an oil executive, right? And at the same time, he was a professional dreamer. He took sabbaticals to Japanese Zen gardens so that he could learn how to listen and, as he called it, learn how to see. And he puts this idea of seeing in contrast with this idea of forecasting, right? So instead of trying to hold on to some idea of what you think the future might hold, instead, you, as a planner, clear your mind. You clear it of all of expectations, and you look at the data. And he worked with his guru in India, as he called them. He worked with him very closely over the years, and he credits this guru with allowing him to be able to see in such a way that through presenting scenarios to the decision makers at Shell, Shell Oil was able to be prepared for both of the oil crises in the 1970s in a way in which no other oil company was able to do. I get chills every time I say that and I think about it. This scenario planning process is transformative. It's revolutionary. And this was in the 70s. And so it has changed a bit since then. But given the level of uncertainty that we are working with today, it is still very, very applicable. And the way that Pierre defines scenario planning is it's a decision-making methodology based on a rigorous analysis of reality that fundamentally changes the mindsets of the decision makers about how the world, and thus how their business, works. Then this idea of changing mindsets is a really important aspect of the scenario planning process, and I can't wait to share more with you on that as we delve into the next section, how to conduct scenario planning. What I'd like to do is take a little bit of time to tell you about my thesis research so that you can have a storyline to follow as we're thinking about this process of conducting scenario planning. Okay, so let's hear the story of Shasta. Shasta is the owner of an ergonomics consulting firm that services the high-tech industry in Silicon Valley. Shasta started her business as a sole practitioner many years ago, servicing these high-tech clients. Her consulting firm grew very quickly, and she hired other consultants. And she approached Soliant Consulting about 10 years ago to help her build an app that would allow her to track her consultants' work when they're on site, visiting employees of these consulting firms, doing evaluations on their posture and, how to improve it and things like that. So this system worked very well for Shasta and her clients for a very long time. But then some things started to happen that were outside of her control. For example, the networks through which FileMaker connected back to the server as it was set up as a client server application model. And those networks started to have more security put on them. And it happened very suddenly. It was definitely very disruptive. And we acted very quickly to put in a short-term fix of providing MiFis to her consultants so that they could bypass the client networks and continue to access the FileMaker system. But obviously, long term, there are much better solutions to that we can provide to Shasta and her employees. Another area that we wanted to look at to transform the system is to be able to provide live access, live on-demand access to the data to her clients. That's something that all organizations in the modern era want access to. But each of us individually also want live access to our data, right? And then what's interesting for her is that each of her clients want something very different. They are all these large corporations with rules and regulations and standard operating procedures that she, as a smaller organization, can be very nimble and pivot and customize her solutions to offer exactly what they need. And that impacts the way that her system works as well, because she needs to be able to track different data and provide different reports of all different kinds to the different clients. And as she onboards new clients, it changes and continues to change. And so this directly ties back to her strategy and how she can be competitive, remain competitive with her clients going forward in the future. As we transform her system, we wanted to understand, okay, so these are the issues that we're facing now. What else might happen? Because especially she's working in the high-tech industry, right? So she is going to definitely be impacted much more quickly before other types of industries might be impacted by changes in technology. Being in California, we know there are a lot of climate change issues. So there's a lot going on there that we wanted to look at to see how would scenario planning impact the efficacy of a digital transformation at Shasta's ergonomics consulting firm. Let's step through the process together. The first place that we want to start when we're looking at this process is to actually look at the outcomes. Little hint, the scenarios themselves are not considered outcomes. What our outcomes are, scenarios can help you imagine how the conditions for success might vary in the future, help you anticipate some of the important decisions you might need to make about policy, resources, and key activities. And they should simplify some of the apparent complexity in the world. And the way that they do this is through carefully considering plausible stories that often describe improbable, dramatic twists in a simple way. And here is the process, in brief, very simplified. First, you define a decision focus. And in our case, that is the digital transformation. Then you perform an environmental scan, which we'll go into in detail. Then you perform a SWOT and or SOAR analysis, which we will also go into detail. And from taking all of that data from the environmental scan and the SWOT and SOAR analysis, you should then be able to develop narratives that will help to change the mindsets of the decision makers to whom you will then present the scenarios in step 5. And finally, the whole team will prepare for multiple futures. And we'll dig into these details together now. So we'll skip over step 1 because we know that we're looking at a digital transformation, and that's our decision focus. So in step 2, what we're doing is scanning the external and internal environments. And from an external perspective, what we're looking at are customers, competitors, suppliers, regulations, environmental laws. Even data could be considered within the external factor. And I have technology and internal factors, but it could also be an external factor. The other internal factors are labor force and norms and values. The way that you scan the internal environment, one of the things that Pierre was famous for in his methodology was utilizing remarkable people. So Pierre had access to a huge budget with Shell Oil, right, where he could travel all over the world and find these remarkable people who weren't necessarily in big oil or even in large corporations. Some of them were futurists, some of them were not. But he had this capability of gaining access to these people and for, compensating them for their time and what have you. So as I was doing my research, and especially with the compressed time period, it wasn't really possible for me to gain access to these types of remarkable people in the way that Pierre was. But thankfully, for me, technology, once again, has democratized the process. And what I was able to do was to use a process called text mining to scan different futurist websites and governmental websites to find out information about what might be happening in the future. So I was able to access digital remarkable people, if you will. I gathered all of that data, and I then took the next step, which ties back to Soliant's co-creation and collaboration digital transformation pillar. And this is where you bring people together from within the organization and perform an analysis with cross-functional employee groups. So the first model is called SWOT, and this is the Harvard policy model that was developed in the 1920s that we spoke about earlier. What you do is you look at an organization's strengths, their weaknesses, their opportunities, and their threats. Now, before I actually had people from these cross-functional teams look at this information, what I did was I took all of the data from the environmental scan and I presented it to them, and I provided them with reading material so that they could get caught up on what is actually happening out there and get their juices and minds flowing before we came into this meeting. And at the meeting, we took the time to I actually did it over Zoom, and we used breakout rooms. And this was in 2018, actually. And everyone had the opportunity to provide some input. And these are people from all across the organization in different roles. The other method that you could look at using is called SOAR. And it is just a variation of SWOT that draws upon the ideas that are in the positive psychology research that, if you look for weaknesses, you'll find weaknesses. If instead of focusing on weaknesses and threats, we focus on aspirations and results, you can actually get a very different set of data from doing this. So after taking step 2 and step 3, I had all of this data in Excel files, and I coded it, and I categorized it, and I went on to step 4, which was to do that analysis of that data and then develop multiple scenario narratives. And through that process, I took time to think and reflect and allow myself to let go of any expectations of what I thought might be happening in the different environments that we looked at, including with Claris FileMaker. And at that time, Claris had not yet become Claris again. So these are the 4 example scenarios that we came up with. And they are on these different axes. So what you want to do when you're developing the scenarios is think about them as polar opposites, because you do want dramatic twists. You want to look at things that might be almost a little bit exaggerated so that you can then really prepare for what could be possible. And we'll go into the details of how you can, approach this from a realistic perspective, approach actually preparing for the different scenarios. But the scenarios themselves are supposed to be somewhat dramatic. And the narrative that we developed around the rapid growth we called it the Valley Hero, right? So Silicon Valley could continue to just increase and continue to grow. And because of things that we saw that were possible in the slowing growth, like with the climate change, we thought, well, Silicon Valley, the technologists there, they might actually come up with some different types of systems that would actually heal the climate change issues that we're experiencing. On the other end of that is the valley decline. And so there could be things like global instability that we spoke of that could cause a decline in the Silicon Valley growth. And actually, that's what we're experiencing now. I did not, my analysis did not produce a pandemic. I sort of kicked myself for that. But we did identify that global instability could cause slowing growth, and that is exactly what is happening now. The other axis here is on the left, supplier inability to provide equipment. And what we called that was supplier stagnation. So there is a possibility that the suppliers were not going to be able to provide the type of equipment that evolution consulting requires to properly fulfill their obligations and their evaluations for the employees of these tech companies. On the other end of that spectrum, it's not necessarily the opposite, but it's related in that there could be very, very significant changes to the equipment needed because of advances in technology like artificial intelligence and artificial reality or augmented reality. And so we called that scenario the AI takeoff. And we developed some narratives around those to explain how and what that might look like. So going off of those 4 different narratives, the way that we would then approach step 5, which ties back to Soliant's governance model, as well as the iterative and data-driven pillars, is there are really 5 main steps. So all you have to do, and it's kind of amazing to me how simple this is. You evaluate the potential impacts of each of the scenarios, identify the potential strategies that you could take for each of those potential scenarios and impacts of the scenarios. Then you prioritize the strategies. And what you want to do is prioritize them in order of how likely they are to occur, and in order of the urgency of which the impact might have. And then you execute the strategies. And what's very, very important, and what we have to continue to remember throughout this whole thing, is that none of this scenario planning process, none of strategic planning is one and done. We're not talking about 5, 10, or 20-year planning that happens every 5 years or every 10 years. We're talking about, still do those 5-year plannings and maybe even 20-year planning processes. But this scenario planning process needs to continue to happen as you continue to monitor your environment. It has to be done on a routine basis, and you really need to look at your environment and continue to monitor it and to see if any of what you have, identified as a potential impact is starting to come true in the environment around you. And then you can reprioritize if necessary so that you can ramp up your own internal processes to meet those different impacts and to address them. So here's my thesis research by the numbers. First off, the first thing they had to do is a literature review. And so I read hundreds of articles and books during this time, really thinking about what the angle was that I wanted to take to formulate my question that I wanted to explore, which is the impact of scenario planning and the efficacy of digital transformations that you've heard quite a number of times now. And then the other aspect of this that is easily measurable is I took 10 different web scans using the text mining functionality that I mentioned before, looking at 10 different futuristic websites and governmental websites and as part of the environmental scan. I also held 3 workshops with the internal employees of Evolution Consulting, and that made up the real aspect of the scenario planning process, those first 3. Because what you have to keep in mind is that my thesis research covered only the scenario planning process. It did not cover the actual execution of the digital transformation, and that's because I had a limited time period that I had to finish my thesis in order to graduate. And we didn't know when the actual digital transformation project was going to be executed. And in fact, so we started the scenario planning project when we were, about maybe a tenth of the way through the requirements gathering. And so it acted as part of the requirements gathering process for the digital transformation, which is how it should be in the real world as well. And then after I completed the scenario planning process, that led to a software comparison project. And then the software comparison project was, another aspect of the requirements gathering. And then we delved really deeply into speccing out the new system and gathering user requirements and things like that from a very detailed perspective. And so after I finished the scenario planning process, I then interviewed 8 of the participants, and I asked them each 8 different questions. And so from that information, I had, again, a big set of data, 64 different questions, basically, that I was able to categorize and code and analyze to present back to my thesis advisor and my client and you all here now about what is the impact of scenario planning on the efficacy of digital transformations. And so what we found is that 100% of the participants predicted that the scenario planning process would have a positive impact on the digital transformation. Here are some of the impressions that people had. So one of the leaders stated that it impacted my strategy in terms of how to stay ahead of my competitors. Another participant said, intentionally looking into the future and asking what is going to change externally and how can we be ahead of that was so powerful. And finally, it produced nuanced data that I can provide to my clients for their own decision-making processes. And those are just a sample of some of the impressions. From an overall perspective, the total of the data really broke down into these 2 different categories, in business performance and employee engagement and growth. If you read my thesis, which you can find in the references section at the end of this video, or you can just search Kristy Lapidus thesis and it will come up there in Google, you'll find that there is one other category, but that dealt mainly with the mechanics of my research process and how to improve it. So it's not really germane to what we're covering here today in my session. So in terms of business performance, what we're looking at there is how well a business meets its strategic and operational objective. That's how we're defining that. And employee engagement and growth is a little bit more squishy. But what we found, and what I wasn't necessarily looking for, nor necessarily expected, is that participants reported a deep gratitude for being able to participate in the scenario planning project. They felt recognized and valued. It brought meaning to their work. Thus, the conclusion can be drawn was that involving organization members in strategic planning that is participative in nature increases engagement. What exactly do we mean when we say employee engagement? The Society of Human Resource Management defines employee engagement as the extent to which employees feel passionate about their jobs, are committed to the organization, and put discretionary effort into their work. And why does this matter? Because it improves business performance, it promotes retention, and it fosters customer loyalty. And here are some numbers from another source to back that up. So this is from a Gallup study done in 2017, which found that employee engagement increases productivity by 17%, increases sales by 20%, and increases profitability by 21%. So these are some very real, specific numbers that you can wrap your mind around to understand what the value of employee engagement is. And so you might ask, how exactly is that employee engagement created? There are a number of different ways. As it relates to the work that we're doing and talking about today, think about Soliant's 5th digital transformation pillar of co-creation and collaboration. Not only do the participative planning techniques that we talk about in that pillar create buy-in and produce more resilient solutions, but they also build engagement and contribute to employee growth. People want to be heard. They need to be heard, seen, and respected. And allowing people to express their opinion, to give voice to what's coming up for them is very, very important. And just because you allow someone to, give their opinion doesn't mean that they will necessarily have a say in the final decision, right? There are decision-making processes which are separate from the co-creation and collaboration process. And what you'll find is that when people are heard and when their voices are heard, they are much less likely to buy into the end solution, whether it includes what they recommended or not. It's that fact of being heard and included and having a sense of belonging that matters. Circling back to business performance, what we are talking about there from an operational standpoint are these lists of measurable objectives, which can, many of them, be very clearly tied back to how well a business application is working. So like the number of evaluations that the system or that the client consultants are able to perform on employees is directly tied back to how well the business application is working. And it also connects to the quality of the evaluations and to the number of employee issues resolved. So there are a lot of ways in which the business performance of an organization, and specifically this ergonomics organization's business performance, is related to the business application and thus how that application will be digitally transformed. When we're speaking about strategic objectives, remember what we're looking at in terms of improving the scenario, the digital transformation, is being able to prepare for these multiple different scenarios. With that in mind, let's look at some of the results of the environmental scan that we did. So what we found is that these different areas could have an impact on the business and thus could have an impact on the business application system, which we were transforming. First off, in the upper left-hand corner, artificial intelligence, machine learning, augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, all of those things are advances in technology that are happening now, that are impacting the systems now, or impacting the way that my clients does business now to a certain degree. But in 2 years and 3 years, it's going to be even greater. And so we have to build the system to work for those types of environments. Also, employee expectations. So we know that employees have a certain expectation for the way the internal business systems work because they have wide access to really excellent systems in their own personal lives, on their phones, on their watches, on their iPads, or other types of tablets. So that's something that we also have to keep in mind, and which will have an impact on the success of the digital transformation. Climate change. You might not immediately think about climate change when you think about doing a digital transformation of an internal business application, but keep in mind that this application that was once an internal business application is now part of an organization that is much more porous, that is really needs to integrate with client systems in real time and provide real live data that can be visualized into reports and narratives very quickly. And so the systems that we're looking at, if the business performance of the consulting firm is impacted by the climate change that's happening, for example, the wildfires in California that are happening right now, that could impact some of the businesses that my client services, and thus could impact her business, and thus could impact the digital transformation. Finally, what we have here on the right are wearables and exoskeletons. So I'm super passionate about this area. I think it's super cool. My cousin actually works in the auto industry. He runs the robotics area of an auto manufacturer back in the Midwest. And he has colleagues who are working on the production floor of the factory where he works. And they are wearing these types of exoskeletons now. These exoskeletons keep workers from getting harmed. They help them to work longer without getting tired. They help them to do things that they would never actually be able to do without the additional support and strength of these exoskeletons. So that is something that is occurring today, and that is just going to continue to grow. This merging of man and machine is continuing to progress at an ever increasing rate. And you can imagine how something like that might translate into an office environment, right? So that you might have smart office furniture. You can think about like post-pandemic, you have the high-tech company that, is allowing more of their employees to work from home. So they have a reduced footprint in terms of office space, which means they have more desks, which are hotel desks, right? Which people can come to and use for a certain period of time. And then another person might use the desk later in the day, for example. And so this office furniture could be smart in nature. You might be able to come to this hotel desk, put your finger down or your hand down, and the desk could recognize who you are and automatically adjust based upon the settings that you have pre-configured to be to your liking and to best support you. And even further, because it could be equipped with AI and ML, it can also tell what state your current body is in your physiological structure, in your needs and your discomforts, and it could automatically adjust to properly support you. So obviously, that could relate back to this digital transformation very, very clearly, but it doesn't yet today. And so that's why it's really important that when you're doing this kind of work, that you look to the future to see what impacts might be coming down the road. These are the specific recommendations that we had for applying the results of the scenario planning analysis to the digital transformation of the Claris FileMaker app at the consulting firm. And I really think that all of these could be applied to really any type of digital transformation that you're doing on the Claris FileMaker app, within reason. I didn't include some of the other ones that were very specific in nature and that included proprietary information specific to my client. But these three, I think, are really, really impactful. So architect the app so that it can handle continual changes by using a combination of Claris FileMaker, cloud-native programming languages, and AWS cloud services. For example, think about IoT. So we talked about having smart office furniture that automatically adjusts and reacts to the person who is using it. Now, because it can sense different information about the person sitting in it regarding their posture and other physiological data and send that back to the business application system, send that back to Claris, you can imagine that with a huge number of employees some of these high-tech companies have, that could quickly scale to tens of thousands of IoT devices and very, very large amounts of data. So using AWS services for managing that data and for processing it, like using something like Redshift and the AWS services for this use case would provide for flexible scaling up or down as the requirements change. You can also leverage data to build smart functionality into the app. I think that's a wise choice to think about whenever you're doing a modern digital transformation. Collect more and better data to provide metrics that tell valuable stories. And now let's look at increasing ROI and user adoption through change management. So these recommendations are something that came up through the literature review that I did at the beginning of the thesis process. And it validated some of the work that I had already looked at and why I even went into this Pepperdine MSOD program and what I spoke about at DevCon 2018. So from the beginning of having a project plan in place, you should also have a change management plan in place that intertwines with the project plan at key points. You always need to have an executive sponsor, and Another key aspect of the change plan is the communication plan. And so you and that executive sponsor and other key stakeholders will need to inspire other stakeholders throughout the company with a shared vision. The communication plan should also provide a rationale, outline benefits of the change, invite input, and provide progress updates. The training, and then finally, the change management plan should include a training plan. So that seems like a lot, and it may be a lot more than you're currently doing with your projects that you're working on now with your digital transformation projects. But keep in mind what the success rate is of digital transformation projects. And what we mean by success is that it's on time, on budget, and produces within scope and produces the business results that the clients are looking for. And the reason why you would want to do that is to improve that success rate. And studies show, in this case by ProSci, the guys behind ProSci, the people, and they wrote this book, The People Side of Change, that applying behavioral science in the form of change management can increase project success rate by 6 times. Think about that for a moment. In terms of the training aspect of change management, what's important to keep in mind is that it's not just a transfer of the technical and procedural information. What you need to allow your users to do is to practice. According to the research on brain science, practicing a new habit under the right conditions can change the connections between the nerve cells and our neural pathways. And repeating it often strengthens those pathways. Further, we can be motivated to repeat behavior if we believe we will reap a reward. And once the new behavior becomes automatic, the reward does not need to continue. For example, with the digital transformation, you could request more volunteers to test within the client organization than you normally would. And then you can reward those who enter, so many different new records in a certain period of time with a paid day off or, something of that nature, something silly, the ability maybe to, attend a cool thing that they've wanted to attend for a long time. There's a lot of different opportunities here to increase the probabilities of adoption by your users by just looking at how you can give them the ability to practice, to repeat that practice, and to offer them simple rewards. And finally, intensity of feeling. So emotions are necessary to embed learning. The stronger the emotions people feel while learning, the better they can recall the information later. And it's important to remember that emotion can be either positive or negative. However, only overly negative emotions can shut down learning. You can induce positive feelings through facilitated team collaboration. And this research on brain science shows that feeling intensity comes from people being able to apply their own thoughts and creativity and have their own voices welcomed and heard. And that's one more reason to involve people from across all of the organization from day one. Back to the communication plan. So it's important that you make it social inclusive. It's also important that your change management plan is philosophically aligned with the type of organization in which you are implementing it. So, for example, in a manufacturing environment that is hierarchical in structure, one-on-one manager meetings are going to be very powerful. You have people who are used to getting important information directly from their managers, and you want to keep that in mind. Now, if you're working and compare that then with an organization like Soliant, which is much flatter in organizational design structure, right? And there are fewer levels, and I'm sure many of the other consulting firms out there are like this. There are fewer levels of hierarchy, and there's more autonomy for all of the different people. So starting with participative workshops might be the way to go in that type of organization. You just have to remember that these, as one of my professor, Dr. Miriam Lacey, who was also my thesis advisor, and big shout out to her. Thank you, Miriam. But one thing she would always say is that you don't want to walk into a company with your change management kit and be an OD weenie. That's just not something that you want to do. You have to really understand the environment in which you're operating in and tailor the solutions that you're bringing to that environment. Just like you would with software, you have to do it with your change management plan. And so the first three on here are highlighted because they are really the most impactful and the most inclusive, and they can be done on their own in some instances. So you should really never only use posters and signage or email reminders and messages as the only way of communicating change. And now we'll do a quick summary so we can let all this information seep in. We can really break down this presentation into 4 main points. Business strategy, not technology, should drive digital transformations. Read more of Gerald C. Kane on that. 2, to address uncertainty, routinely identify and monitor your strategies using a multi-stream strategic planning technique like scenario planning. 3, use inclusive and participative change management that includes stakeholders from across the organization and of all different learning and personality types, because that will help you create more resilient solutions, create buy-in, which increases user adoption and ROI, increase employee engagement, which increases your business performance. And finally, build business applications using agile principles and in a way that can flex with ever-changing business needs. And I will just leave you with this final quote from one of the participants in the research study who said, "If someone asked me about what to improve with the software, I certainly would not have thought about all the future forward scenarios we considered. It provided an important viewpoint that we would never have considered otherwise." Thanks so much for joining today. I am going to quickly just surf through these pages of references to give credit where credit is due.